This is a presentation on stamps moved by war, and it is a presentation for the Winnipeg Philatelic Society, Western Canada's oldest stamp club. And the hint we should get from the stamp, which is a 1950 French stamp celebrating the Journée du Timbre, it's a French letter carrier, so it is about French stamps that were moved by war. Now, the first French stamps depicted series, and they were issued in 1849. There were 6 values issued between 1849 and 1850, and this followed the overthrow of the last French monarchy. France was 9 years later than the United Kingdom in issuing stamps. The other thing, French stamps, the definitive stamps, often depict iconic French females, Marianne, La Semeuse, Liberté, things like that. And that is, if you collect British stamps or Canadian stamps, you're used to having the monarch on the stamps. If you collect stamps from the United States, you're used to having on the early stamps presidents on the stamp, on the definitive stamps. With the overthrow of the last French monarchy occurring in 1848, you're not going to have a French monarch on French stamps. So this is the Second Republic, and you see the stamps say Republic of France, and it was between 1848 and 1851, only 4 years. Napoleon III, who was born in 1808 and died in 1873, was the first president of the French Republic, Second French Republic. He was a nephew of Napoleon I. His father was Napoleon's brother and was King of Holland between 1806 and 1810. So as I said, between 1848 and 1851, it was the Republic of France. These stamps were actually issued in 1852, and you can see they still say Republic of France. Napoleon III didn't let that stay for long, because in 1851 he proclaimed himself emperor. The Constitution prohibited a second term. He decided that it would be a clever idea to try to amend it, and was unsuccessful. So in 1851 he staged a military coup. And there are about 30 values issued, perforate and imperforate. Here is one of them, and it is the Empire franc, the French Empire. Now, by 1870, Napoleon III is quite ill, and European politics are as confusing as always, I guess, in 1870. And Bismarck from Prussia wanted to start a war and wanted to try to trick France into starting a war. So in July of 1870, France declared war on Prussia. So the Franco-Prussian War started with France attacking Prussia, and Prussia counterattacked through Alsace-Lorraine. The Franco-Prussian War was what caused Alsace-Lorraine to be ceded to Germany, which France didn't get back until the end of the First World War. The Battle of Sedan, and this was the first Battle of Sedan, there was a Battle of Sedan in World War II as well, but in the Battle of Sedan that occurred in September of 1870, France lost. Napoleon III was captured and surrendered to Bismarck, and Napoleon was then exiled to England, where he died 3 years later. At this point, Paris is besieged for 5 months between September 1870 and the end of January 1871. So the French post office was unable to distribute stamps printed in Paris because there was a blockade. So it was necessary to move the production of stamps to Bordeaux, And this is referred to as the Bordeaux Issue. And here's an example of one of them. And we're back to an image of Ceres, and we're back to the Republic of France, and this is now the beginning of the Third French Republic. And here's another example, Republic France, the Third French Republic. There were 11 values and 2 designs issued in 1870. Now, the other thing that happened to move the way the mail was moved during the Franco-Prussian War was the Ballon Monte, and this is a stamp that was issued, Scott C44, Hiver A45, and it's an airmail stamp, of course. And it recognizes the 100th anniversary in 1971 of the Ballon Monte. And Ballon Monte were manned balloons as opposed to non-monte. And the purpose was to get mail out of Paris. Paris was blockaded, and there was no way to get mail into or out of Paris. So over the 5 months, there were 67 flights, and the balloon flights carried 164 people out of Paris, 381 pigeons, the idea being the pigeons were carrier pigeons, so they'd carry messages back to Paris. 5 dogs that were supposed to do the same thing, but none of them were successful. And 2.5 million pieces of mail. In all, it was reasonably successful. 2 of the 67 balloons were lost. It's believed they blew out over the Atlantic and were lost in the Atlantic Ocean. 5 were captured. This was the first creation of anti-aircraft guns to try to shoot down the balloons, but most of them were up high enough that they couldn't be shot down. So 2.5 million pieces of mail. So you can still get, if you want to, you can go on eBay, they're not cheap, but you can buy a Ballon Monte cover. They may have been marked par Ballon, but perhaps not. You mostly tell by the postmark. If it's postmarked in Paris, in the relevant date frame, then it got out of Paris by Ballon Monte. But that only took the mail out of Paris. So how do we get mail back in to Paris? So again, a stamp was issued for this in 1979, and it's the Bulumul. So these were prepared in Moulins on the Allier River, and they were zinc balls with fins to make roll along. And so the stamp actually describes this quite well. We see the zinc ball with its lid and containing letters, and we see the fins, and that's supposed to make the ball roll along the bottom of the Seine. We see Paris surrounded, and Bray-sur-Seine is where they were placed in the Seine River. Moulins is actually kind of a long way away from Paris, but it just happened to be a convenient post office that you could send your mail to, and then it would be put into the Bourg du Moulin, and it would roll along the bottom of the Seine. So the letters were addressed Paris par Moulin Allier, and that's how you would make sure it got to, so you'd address it to the Parisian address and then put that on the bottom of the envelope. This didn't work well at all. The idea was these were going to roll along the bottom of the Seine and be captured in Paris. 55 were sent with 40,000 letters, and none arrived, not one. Now, before around 1910, that's 40 years, 25 or so were recovered. They were found in various places along the Seine as things were dredged. A couple were even found out in the Atlantic Ocean. They'd gone all the way down the Seine, gone through Paris and not been captured. To date, about 35 have been recovered. And if they were recovered and the letters were given to the post office, some are thought to have been recovered by not the post office. The letters were then delivered. So you can get a Bulldo Letter. You have to be careful. And of course, there are only 40,000 of them. A final 14,000 letters were delivered by being hidden in bags of rice, being delivered to Paris. So there's 2 or 3 actually different types of Bulldo letter. Of the 40,000 letters that were put in the balls and rolled along, many have been recovered. You can get one of those if you want. That takes us to the Second World War, and we now get the 1944 series of stamps. 10 stamps were issued. The value is in the same color as the stamp. We will see there's a second series where the value is in black, printed on the stamp. And these were printed by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and printed in the United States and then shipped across the ocean. And they were used as the Allied forces came up from Marseille and into Corsica first, and as they moved through Normandy, they were issued by the Allied occupation forces. They're in values from 5 centimes, which is the one illustrated, to 10 francs. Interestingly, I have a 1956 Scott catalog, and they're not cataloged as stamps of France. They're cataloged as stamps of the Allied occupation force. Now, what happened? These were to have been used by the Allied military government administering France, but instead they recognized the de Gaulle government. So they were transferred to the Free French in July 1944, which is not long after the Normandy invasion. And they were to be used in liberated areas as the Allied forces moved into France. And by October the 9th, 1944, they were on sale in Paris. And I've got the Scott and Hiver numbers there, and you can see the Hiver just cataloged them as French stamps all along. But you can see that Scott had to kind of fit them in with capital letters because they had originally not provided catalog number spots for these stamps because they thought they were Allied stamps, not French stamps. But they were issued by the French government, the Free French government of de Gaulle. The second series, 10 stamps, these are the ones where the value is printed in black. And again, Scott had to fit them in. They didn't originally catalog these as French stamps. And you notice they say France. Our American friends, when they're printing these, had to be creative, so they had to think of something that might appeal. So they've got liberty, equality, fraternity down at the bottom, and they just say France. And again, we see Scott had to fit him in. 1944, another series of 19 stamps, and this is, I have fun figuring these out because some of the values are the Gallic cock and some of the values are Marianne. And so there are examples of each of the designs. There were 19 stamps in all. This was the beginning of the French Republic, and so you will have noted that they say Republic of France. And they were first issued in Corsica after the Allied landing, and they were issued in Paris in November 15th, 1944. And they were commissioned by the Free French government, but printed by De La Rue, who prints a lot of British stamps, in London on the orders of the Free French government. And it is Marianne de Dulac. So that's my story, 2 stories of 2 sets of stamps that were printed in different places because of war in France, and then some other interesting postal impacts of the war of Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So, thanks for listening.